The Atlantic in 1942 was a graveyard. Ships went down by the hundreds, swallowed by black waves and the silent jaws of steel predators, German U-boats. Deep below, in the cramped hull of U-156, Captain Werner Hartenstein listened to the rhythmic hum of the diesel engines. Each vibration felt like a heartbeat, the pulse of a war that demanded obedience, not questions. Hartenstein was no ordinary officer, educated, disciplined, even courteous. He was the kind of man who still wrote letters to his mother every week, the kind who thanked his crew for their service after each patrol. But war doesn't reward decency. It rewards victory, and in 1942, victory meant tonnage, sinking Allied shipping faster than they could rebuild it. The Battle of the Atlantic was Hitler's invisible front. No trenches, no faces, just sonar pings and death in the dark. Every man aboard U-156 knew his place, from the torpedo mechanic to the radio man. They were hunters, sworn to their captain, sealed inside a 70-meter tube of steel, gliding silently beneath the waves. That September, they were operating off the coast of West Africa. The air inside the submarine was heavy. Oil, sweat, and diesel mixed with the tension of men who hadn't seen daylight in days. Then, one morning, the sound man heard it. A faint throb of propellers somewhere to the north. "Ship bearing 090, he whispered. Hartenstein raised his binoculars and adjusted the periscope. Through the murky lens, a massive shape cut across the horizon. A British troop ship painted in dull gray, heavily laden. He smiled grimly. This was what they were trained for. He gave the order. "Prepare torpedoes 1 and 2. Moments later, 2 sleek silver fish slid into the water, streaking toward their target. 30 seconds of silence. Then, boom! A blinding flash tore through the distant ship. The RMS Laconia, a converted passenger liner, shuddered, split, and began to list. The crew erupted in cheers. Another Allied ship destroyed. Another victory for the Kriegsmarine. But then, through the periscope, Hartenstein saw something that froze him. The sea was littered with people, hundreds of them, men, women, children, clinging to debris, screaming. And there, on the ship's lifeboats, was something unmistakable. Red Cross markings. Hartenstein's heart stopped. This wasn't just a troop transport. The Laconia was carrying over 2,700 people, including British civilians, Italian prisoners of war, and Polish guards. He had just torpedoed a floating humanitarian disaster. The cheering on U-156 faded as realization spread. The crew watched their captain, waiting for orders. And that was the moment Werner Hartenstein, a German naval hero, faced the impossible choice that would define his life: obey orders or obey his conscience. He turned to his first officer. "We will surface," he said quietly. The crew looked stunned. Surfacing in enemy waters was suicide. But Hartenstein's voice didn't waver. "There are survivors out there. We are going to help them." The hunter was about to become the rescuer. And in that decision, made in defiance of everything his uniform stood for, began one of the most extraordinary acts of humanity in the entire war. The dawn that rose over the South Atlantic on September 13, 1942, should have been like any other, calm, merciless, infinite. But this morning the sea was alive with wreckage. Bodies floated beside splintered wood. Overturned lifeboats drifted helplessly, and hundreds of voices called out for salvation that would not come. From the bridge of U-156, Captain Werner Hartenstein watched through his binoculars, his jaw set, his stomach heavy. The cries echoed across the water, and human, desperate, endless. He lowered the glasses and spoke softly to his first officer, Lieutenant zur See Christian Gross. "There are too many. We can't just leave them." Gross hesitated. "Herr Kapitän, the order from Admiral Dönitz is clear. We do not rescue enemy survivors." Hartenstein's gaze hardened. "They are not the enemy anymore," he said. "They are drowning men, and some are not men at all." He could see the lifeboats clearly now. Women clutching infants, sailors bleeding, Italian POWs waving shirts tied to sticks in surrender. Among them floated a makeshift raft carrying half-burned lifebelts marked RMS Laconia. With a deep breath, Hartenstein made his choice. "Surface," he ordered, "and signal all hands. Prepare to render aid." The U-boat's hull broke the waves like a beast coming up for air. The crew scrambled onto the deck, lowering ropes and hauling survivors from the sea. Some of the British soldiers hesitated, expecting betrayal. But instead of bullets, they were given blankets, water, and chocolate rations. Within an hour, over 100 people were crammed aboard the narrow deck of U-156. Men of different nations, once sworn to kill each other, now shivering shoulder to shoulder under the burning African sun. Hartenstein ordered a Red Cross flag painted on the deck, and a large makeshift banner hung across the conning tower. "German submarine, rescue ship, under Red Cross." It was an act of defiance, not against his enemy, but against the machine of war itself. At 10 sudden hours, Hartenstein sent a coded message to German Naval Command, reporting that he had sunk the Laconia and was now engaged in a rescue operation. He requested permission to continue aid and asked for surface ships to rendezvous for evacuation. The message stunned headquarters. A U-boat captain voluntarily aiding the enemy? It went against every standing order. But even Admiral Karl Dönitz, cold, methodical, loyal to Hitler, could not bring himself to reprimand a man saving lives. He forwarded Hartenstein's position to Vichy French authorities, who agreed to send 3 ships from Dakar and Casablanca to collect the survivors. Help was on its way, at least on paper. In the meantime, Hartenstein continued the impossible balancing act of compassion and command. He divided his rations among the survivors, allowed injured men to be treated inside the boat, and assigned his sailors to keep watch for sharks circling the wreckage. "Give them what we can spare," he said, "and pray the sky stays empty." On the morning of September 16th, after 3 days adrift, U-156 was still waiting for the French ships. By now, over 200 survivors were attached to the submarine, some on deck, others towed behind on lifeboats connected by ropes. The Red Cross flag fluttered in the wind. The message was clear, visible, human. Then the lookout shouted, "Aircraft, approaching from the east." Hartenstein rushed to the bridge and looked up. A twin-engine B-24 Liberator appeared, glinting in the sunlight. American. He grabbed the signal lamp and began flashing a message. "Submarine engaged in rescue work, under Red Cross." For a moment, the aircraft seemed to acknowledge. It circled once, low and slow. Hartenstein could even see the pilot, a young American in a white helmet, leaning out of the cockpit. Then, without warning, the Liberator banked hard and dropped a bomb. The explosion erupted just 50 meters from the submarine, throwing survivors and lifeboats into the air. Screams filled the ocean once more. "Dive! Dive!" shouted Gross. But Hartenstein froze. To dive meant killing everyone still clinging to the ropes. Hundreds of them. He looked around, faces pale, terrified, helpless. "No," he whispered. "We stay up." Another bomb fell, closer this time. Shrapnel tore through the conning tower. The deck was chaos. Wounded men, broken lifeboats, sailors shouting in every language. It was madness. A rescue turned massacre. Finally, with no choice left, Hartenstein gave the order. "Cut the lines. Get below. Dive." The submarine slipped beneath the waves, leaving behind the very people it had tried to save. Inside the submerged hull, the men sat in stunned silence. The captain's face was pale, his hands trembling. They could still hear the explosions above, fading slowly into the distance. After what felt like hours, the sound of the engines returned. The Liberator was gone. Hartenstein leaned against the steel wall, eyes closed. He had defied his orders to save human lives, and the world had answered with bombs. In that moment, something in him broke. Not his loyalty, not his courage, but the last fragile thread that tied him to the idea of a just war. He turned to his crew, his voice low and bitter. "Remember this," he said. "When they ask us why we fight, tell them it's because no one else remembers mercy." In the days that followed, U-156 rendezvoused with the French ships and transferred what survivors it still had. Some 1,500 people had died in the water. Men, women, and children, not from the torpedoes, but from the war's refusal to recognize humanity on either side. The Laconia Incident, as it came to be known, shocked the world. Admiral Dönitz issued a new command. No further rescue of survivors is to be attempted. It became the infamous Laconia Order, a directive that condemned countless more to drown in silence. As for Hartenstein, he carried the weight of that day for the rest of his short life. He continued to command U-156 until March 8, 1943, when his submarine was sunk by an American aircraft near Barbados. No one survived. Years later, British survivors of the Laconia remembered the German captain who risked everything to save them. They called him the man with the conscience. In the end, his act of mercy outlived his nation's cause. War demanded obedience. Hartenstein offered compassion. And somewhere, deep beneath the Atlantic, the echoes of that choice still linger. A reminder that even in humanity's darkest depths, one man's conscience can rise to the surface. The war moved on. Battles were fought, ships were sunk, medals were pinned, and forgotten. But the sea never forgets. The Atlantic still whispered the names of the drowned, and among them, one name surfaced again and again in quiet recollections, in whispered survivor stories, in the corridors of post-war inquiry, Werner Hartenstein. After the sinking of U-156 in March 1943, the man himself was gone. His logbooks, his crew, his voice, all swallowed by the deep. But the legacy of his act of mercy did not die with him. It began to echo through unexpected places. Naval reports, courtroom testimonies, survivor diaries, and in the hearts of those who had once clung to his submarine's steel hull, waiting for salvation. In London, the British Admiralty received the first detailed reports of the Laconia incident in early 1943. Survivors from the lifeboats that had reached the West African coast were interrogated. One of them, Lieutenant Commander Geoffrey Gwither, described a scene that defied wartime logic. The German captain, "He treated us with humanity. We were given blankets, even chocolate. He seemed more a doctor than a soldier." The intelligence officers looked at each other uneasily. This didn't fit the image of the enemy they'd built in the public mind. To the propagandists, the U-boats were monsters. To the sailors, they were ghosts. To the men who'd seen Hartenstein, he was neither. He was human. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German U-boat fleet, faced a very different reckoning. The Laconia Order had been signed. Cold, bureaucratic, absolute. It read, "No attempt of any kind shall be made to rescue survivors." Rescue contradicts the most basic demands of warfare for the destruction of enemy ships and crews. But in private, Dönitz was haunted by what Hartenstein had done. He knew the man, knew his discipline, his loyalty, his bravery. Hartenstein had not been weak. He had simply remembered what it meant to be human, and that frightened everyone. In 1946, after the war, several diaries from Laconia survivors were recovered and archived in Britain's Imperial War Museum. Among them was the journal of Lieutenant Robert Medley, a young officer who had been aboard one of the lifeboats rescued by U-156. His entry from September 15, 1942, read, "We were certain we were finished. Then out of the smoke came the U-boat, rising like a whale. We thought they were going to machine gun us. Instead, the captain came out himself. He offered his hand and I shook it. He said, 'You are safe now.' That moment, the war disappeared. There were no sides, only men." Another diary, from Maria Romano, an Italian nurse who had been a passenger on the Laconia, recounted how the German sailors shared their bread and helped bandage her leg. One of them smiled and said, "We are all sailors before we are enemies." I never forgot that. These were small acts, meaningless in the scale of world war, but monumental in the scale of the human soul. They revealed a side of the Atlantic War that history tried to bury, that compassion could survive even under the swastika. When the war finally ended, Admiral Dönitz stood trial at Nuremberg in 1946. Among the charges brought against him was the Laconia Order, which prosecutors called evidence of deliberate murder. The British and Americans presented intercepted signals showing that Hartenstein had been bombed, despite flying the Red Cross flag. It was one of the few moments during the trial when the courtroom fell silent. Dönitz defended himself coldly. "I had to ensure the success of my forces. Rescue endangered the submarine and its crew." Then he added something unexpected. "The commander of U-156 acted from humanity. I never punished him for it." His words carried no emotion, yet in that sterile courtroom, they marked the first time an admiral of Hitler's navy publicly admitted that compassion was not treason. When the verdict came, Dönitz was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. But for many observers, it was Hartenstein's ghost that truly lingered in that chamber. The man who had done what even his admiral could not. Decades later, in the 1990s, oceanographers discovered remnants of U-156 off the coast of Barbados. It was nothing more than a broken cylinder of rust and coral. But within it, researchers found fragments of personal belongings: a watch, a pair of binoculars, a dented metal flask engraved with initials, W.H. No bodies remained, only the silence of the deep. But that discovery rekindled interest in Hartenstein's story. In 2002, British historian James Hamilton Patterson published The Laconia Incident, a survivor's tale, which brought the captain's forgotten heroism back into public light. It led to documentaries, interviews with descendants, and a BBC dramatization titled The Sinking of the Laconia, 2010, which portrayed Hartenstein as neither villain nor saint, but as a man at war with himself. The story of Hartenstein forces an uncomfortable truth upon anyone who studies war. Morality and duty are not the same. The captain had followed his conscience and was punished by fate. Dönitz had followed his orders and was punished by history. Between them lay the wreckage of 1,600 lives, and the eternal question of what it means to be human in times of inhumanity. A letter discovered in 1942 from Hartenstein to his fiancée, Ursula, written weeks before the Laconia sinking, offered a haunting premonition. "If I must die in this war, I hope it is for something more than obedience. The sea does not care for politics. It only tests the heart." The letter was never sent. It remained sealed in his personal chest, recovered by German naval archivists years later. Today, it sits in the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg, Germany. A love letter turned moral confession. In the years that followed, the story of the Laconia became a case study in military ethics. It was taught in naval academies in Britain, the US, and even Germany. Young cadets were shown photographs of U-156 with survivors clinging to its deck and asked a simple question: "What would you have done?" Most hesitated. Some answered, "Follow orders." A few whispered, "Follow conscience." In that pause, between duty and morality, lies the true legacy of Captain Werner Hartenstein. He was not a hero in the conventional sense. He didn't win battles, didn't sink a record number of ships, didn't live to see victory. But he proved that even in the heart of destruction, mercy could surface, fragile, fleeting, but unforgettable. Today, if you stand on the beaches of Barbados, where U-156 sleeps, and listen closely to the ocean, you can almost hear it. The faint hum of an engine, the echo of a man's voice carried by the wind. You are safe now. In the cold, austere lecture halls of naval academies across Europe, the story of Werner Hartenstein became an unlikely case study, not for tactics, not for victories, but for the single question his act of compassion had left behind. Can morality survive underwater? It was the 1950s, a decade of rebuilding and reckoning. Germany was split in two, its military legacy tainted by the crimes of the Third Reich. The Kriegsmarine had been dissolved, its surviving officers living quiet lives in anonymity, some haunted, others defiant. But among the archives left behind in Freiburg and Flensburg, one file kept resurfacing: U-156, the Laconia Incident. In 1953, A young West German naval historian named Dr. Klaus Reinhardt stumbled upon a set of transcripts from the Nuremberg trials, buried deep in a box labeled Operational Conduct U-Boats. Inside, he found the radiograms exchanged between U-156, U-506, and the Italian submarine Capellini during the rescue of the Laconia survivors, complete with desperate Morse-coded pleas. Have 200 survivors on deck, including women and children. Need assistance. Red Cross flag displayed. Reinhardt was struck not by the words, but by their tone. Professional, calm, almost apologetic. Here was a German officer defying the image of the fanatical Nazi. Here was a man who had chosen ethics over ideology. In 1956, Reinhardt published a paper titled The Conscience Beneath the Waves. It was banned in East Germany and ignored in the West. But among naval circles, it became whispered reading. It is not enough to win a war, he wrote. One must survive one's own soul. That line would later be quoted, almost verbatim, in the ethics manual of the post-war Bundesmarine, Germany's new navy. When the Bundesmarine was officially established in 1956 under NATO oversight, the ghosts of the Kriegsmarine loomed large. The new German officers were trained under Allied supervision, and the doctrine was clear. There would be no repeat of blind obedience. In Kiel Naval Academy, a portrait of Hartenstein hung briefly on the wall of the ethics classroom, not as a hero, but as a question mark. Beside it, an instructor, Captain Emil Voss, a former U-boat crewman himself, began his lectures the same way each year. Gentlemen, if you are ever asked to choose between orders and your conscience, remember, the sea will remember the choice you made. His students listened in silence. They all knew the story. They had read how Hartenstein's U-156 had surfaced to save its enemies, how it had flown the Red Cross flag, how it had been bombed by an American B-24. They also knew what followed. Dönitz's Laconia order, the chilling command that forbade rescue forevermore. Voss called it, "the day the ocean lost its mercy." And yet, within that tragedy, he told them, lay the proof that even under tyranny, an individual could act with grace. In Britain, the Royal Navy's Staff College at Greenwich took a different approach. They studied the Laconia Incident from a strategic point of view. To them, it was a tactical failure, a communication breakdown, a moment where good intentions collided with the chaos of war. But even among the British, admiration for Hartenstein grew quietly. In 1960, a classified internal memo circulated among British Admiralty officials. It read, "The commander of U-156, by all accounts, behaved with honor in circumstances of extreme difficulty. It is regrettable that our air forces, unaware of his intentions, opened fire." The memo was never made public, but it marked a subtle shift, an acknowledgement that even an enemy could act nobly. Survivors of the Laconia, scattered across Britain, South Africa, and India, continued to write letters to newspapers and veterans associations. One letter, printed in the Times in 1962, read, "We owe our lives to a German submariner who showed us more humanity than the war itself. I pray his name is not forgotten." It was signed, Elizabeth Booth, former passenger RMS Laconia. By the 1970s, war films and novels had begun to romanticize the U-boat service. Das Boot, 1981, would later capture the claustrophobic dread of that world, but few dared to show mercy within it. Then came a BBC radio documentary, The Captain Who Defied the Führer. It featured archival interviews with surviving officers of the 10th U-boat flotilla, who spoke of Hartenstein in reverent tones. "He was not political," said one former crewman, Hans Treichel. "He loved music. He played Beethoven in the control room. When he gave the order to surface and help the Laconia people, we were confused. But he said, 'We are sailors. We save life.' No one argued. That single phrase, 'We are sailors. We save life,' would echo decades later in the Royal Navy's own humanitarian training manuals, cited without attribution. The irony was almost poetic. The Nazis had buried his memory, The Allies had bombed his ship, yet his legacy lived in the navies of both. In the 1990s, as the world grappled with the ethics of modern warfare, drones, precision strikes, civilian casualties, the Laconia story resurfaced again. At The Hague, in a symposium on command responsibility, legal scholar Dr. Michael Bittis presented a paper comparing Hartenstein's actions to those of officers who disobeyed unlawful orders during later conflicts in Vietnam and Iraq. He argued that Hartenstein's defiance was not mutiny but moral courage. He surrendered not his ship, but his soul, to his conscience. In that, he stands among the few who remained human in a time designed to erase humanity. The audience, mostly military lawyers and officers, fell silent. Some were visibly shaken, because in that story, they saw the future, one where wars would no longer be fought merely with weapons, but with principles. In 2008, a German-British expedition located what they believed to be the final resting place of U-156, nearly 5,000 meters below the Atlantic surface. A small memorial plaque was later placed in the ocean near the coordinates, reading simply, "Here lies a man who chose mercy." Among those present was Peter Hartenstein, Werner's nephew. He stood at the edge of the research vessel, the wind whipping across the deck, the Atlantic stretching endlessly before him. He dropped a single white rose into the sea and whispered words that cameras did not record. When asked later what he had said, Peter smiled faintly. "I told him the world finally understood." Today, in the archives of the German Naval Memorial in Laboe, a small exhibit honors Hartenstein. There are no medals, no photographs of destruction, only a faded letter and a single compass, recovered from a sunken wreck decades ago. Visitors often pass by it without stopping, unaware that it represents something extraordinary, the moment when war itself hesitated. Because that's what Hartenstein did. He hesitated. He looked into the eyes of his supposed enemies and chose to save them. And in doing so, he condemned himself, but preserved the last fragment of his humanity. Even now, as submarines glide silently through oceans with nuclear payloads, far removed from the crude diesel hum of U-156, the lesson remains unchanged. Technology evolves, weapons evolve, but conscience, that stubborn, fragile compass, remains the only thing that can steer a man through war without losing his soul. The North Atlantic was an open graveyard. Wrecks of ships lay beneath the waves, British, Norwegian, sometimes German, all swallowed by the cold silence of the deep. By 1943, the U-boat war that once seemed a proud crusade for the fatherland had turned into a slaughterhouse for men trapped in steel coffins. Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock stood alone in the command room of U-553, a Type Siphon IC submarine now battered by the unending gauntlet of Allied sonar and depth charges. His face, hardened by 4 years of war, was lit by the dim red glow of the control panels. Around him, his crew whispered and coughed in the recycled air, their eyes sunken and skin waxy. Outside, the sea raged. Inside, guilt festered. It had begun after the sinking of the SS Empire Whale, a merchant ship carrying civilians, refugees from occupied France. When the U-boat torpedoes hit, Lehmann had believed it to be a supply ship feeding Britain's war machine. But when the survivors' screams reached his periscope, when he saw women clutching lifeless infants amid the wreckage, something inside him cracked. He'd ordered the U-boat to surface, against protocol. He'd rescued as many as he could. The crew obeyed, hesitantly, dragging shivering survivors aboard. But when word reached Berlin through intercepted Allied radio, the Kriegsmarine High Command was furious. Humanitarian acts were not heroism in Hitler's Reich. They were betrayal. Since that day, the nickname haunted him. Der mitfühlende Kommandant, the compassionate captain. Now, in the frozen March of 1943, his conscience had become heavier than the tonnage of all the ships he'd sunk. "Depth 50 meters, murmured the helmsman. The submarine trembled as another depth charge exploded somewhere above. The men flinched. Lehmann stared at the map table, the convoy lanes between Greenland and Britain. His orders were clear: intercept, destroy, vanish. But the radio had brought news that gnawed at him. A hospital ship, marked with red crosses, had been spotted in their patrol zone. Berlin's coded message was short and chilling: sink it. Intelligence suggests weapons concealed aboard. He read it twice, then folded it in silence. His first officer, Oberleutnant Karl Brenner, stepped closer. "Sir, the men are anxious. If we keep dodging convoys, we'll be seen as cowards. They trust your leadership, but not your hesitation." Lehman didn't reply. His eyes remained fixed on the chart. "Brenner," he said finally, "if I sink a hospital ship, it won't just be my soul that goes under. It'll be the meaning of everything we fight for." Brenner's jaw tightened. "Meaning?" "The Führer defines meaning." Lehman turned sharply. "Then the Führer can have my commission, but he won't have my conscience." There was silence, broken only by the hum of the engines. 3 nights later, the submarine's periscope broke the surface. Through mist and moonlight, Lehman saw her, the white ship with bold red crosses on her hull. The HMHS St. Andrew, unarmed, moving slowly through the Atlantic chill. He looked down at the torpedo controls. 2 men waited for his order. His hands trembled. He thought of his wife in Hamburg, of the church bells that no longer rang, of the faces of the sailors he'd sent to the deep. "Captain?" whispered Brenner. "The ship is in range." Lehman didn't answer. He lowered the periscope and took a breath that felt like swallowing the ocean. Then quietly he said, "Prepare to dive. Course away from the target." The crew stared. No one moved. Brenner spoke again, voice rising. "Sir, that's a direct order from High Command." Lehman met his gaze. "And I'm giving you mine. Do it!" Moments later, the submarine slid beneath the waves. Not as a predator, but as a fugitive from its own purpose. That night, Lehman sat in his quarters, writing a letter he knew would never be sent. "If this war ever ends," he wrote, "let it be remembered that not all men beneath the swastika were blind. Some of us saw what we became, hunters of the innocent, priests of a false god. I have no illusions of redemption, but I will not murder the helpless for the sake of orders." He signed it simply: Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock, Kapitänleutnant, U-553. He sealed it in a waterproof container and tucked it behind a steel panel in his cabin. A confession buried in the heart of his submarine. At dawn, a new sound cut through the submarine's walls. Pings. "Allied sonar! Depth charges incoming!" shouted Brenner. The hull shuddered as the sea exploded around them. Pipes burst, alarms screamed, and men prayed. Lehman gripped the periscope rail, his knuckles white. They'd been spotted, perhaps by the same ship he'd spared. Retribution had found them. Flooding in the aft compartment. Someone yelled. Lehman ordered, "Blow ballast! Surface!" But the gauges spun wildly. The sea was winning. "Captain?" Brenner shouted. "We can't hold her!" Lehman closed his eyes as the lights flickered. He thought again of the refugees he'd saved months before. Their faces, pale but alive in the moonlight. If this was justice, he accepted it. With one final command, he ordered, "Get the men to the escape hatch. I'll stay." Brenner hesitated, then saluted. "You'll be branded a traitor." Lehman smiled faintly. "So be it. I'd rather die a man than live as a monster." The hull gave a terrible groan. Steel shrieked. The Atlantic swallowed U-553, and with it, the last trace of a man who dared to say no. U-553 was a real German-type 7th-sea submarine, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Karl Thurman. But this dramatized narrative merges historical records and composite experiences from multiple U-boat commanders who struggled with the moral collapse of their cause. Some, like Lehmann Willenbrock, a real U-boat ace, were known for moments of compassion that defied Nazi orthodoxy. By 1943, many captains began questioning the ethics of unrestricted submarine warfare, as mounting civilian casualties blurred the line between duty and atrocity. The sea remembers everything, even the things men try to bury. Spring 1945. 2 years after U-553 vanished into the depths of the North Atlantic. The war in Europe was collapsing. Berlin was a dying flame. The U-boats that had once terrorized convoys were now hunted, broken, or surrendered. Yet somewhere west of Ireland, among shifting currents and gray silence, the wreck of one German submarine still whispered. It was HMS Loch, a Royal Navy frigate assigned to anti-submarine patrols, that first detected the echo. "Contact at 200 meters, sir." "Stationary object." "Metal mass," the sonar operator said, his headphones crackling. The officer of the watch frowned. "Mark the position." "Could be wreckage." When the divers went down 3 days later, what they found startled them. A nearly intact Type 7C submarine resting on the seabed, its hull half buried in silt, the number barely visible under layers of coral and rust. U-553, Lieutenant Peter Graham, a naval diver from Glasgow, led the exploration team. He was 28, pale-eyed, methodical, one of those men who had lost too many friends to U-boats to ever forget their names. Now he was descending into the tomb of one. The ocean pressed in like an ancient weight. Through the beam of his lamp, the U-boat's outline appeared, a spectral shape in the gloom. The conning tower was bent, its periscope snapped, the hatches hung open like mouths frozen mid-scream. Graham steadied his breathing. The wreck was eerie but not empty. Through the forward hatch, the light caught something metallic, glinting faintly, a captain's insignia still pinned to a shredded uniform sleeve. He entered the command room. Everything was where the crew had left it in their last moments. The chart table overturned, dials smashed, coffee mugs still strapped to the bulkhead. He noticed a typewriter jammed with half-typed paper, letters faded but legible. He pulled it free. "All men are accountable before the sea. It does not care for orders. It only mirrors the soul." It wasn't signed, but a nameplate on the wall beside the captain's chair read H. Lehman Willenbrock. Back aboard Loch Morlich, the salvage team worked for days bringing up personal effects. Logbooks, clothing, even a small photograph of a woman and 2 children, warped by salt. Most were routine relics of war. But when Graham returned for a final sweep of the captain's cabin, he found something wedged behind a panel, sealed in a waterproof tube. He pried it open carefully. Inside was a single folded page, written in a tight, deliberate hand. The ink had barely faded. "To whoever finds this, know that not all who fought beneath this flag believed in what it became. The sea has taken me, but I give it this truth. A man must choose his own law. I could not kill the helpless. If that condemns me, then so be it. H. Lehman Willenbrock, Kapitän Leutnant." U-553 Graham read it twice, then lowered his head. For the first time in his naval service, he felt pity for a U-boat captain. Weeks later, the recovered materials arrived at Portsmouth Naval Command. The intelligence officers pored over the documents, debating their authenticity. One commander dismissed them outright. Propaganda or guilt. Either way, irrelevant. He was the enemy. But an older officer, Captain Samuel Mackay, disagreed. "I served in the Atlantic," he said quietly. "I've seen men follow orders that damned them. Maybe this one found a way out before it was too late." The documents were archived under classified, personal correspondence. They never reached the public record. Not until decades later, 1987. Bletchley Park Archives. Dr. Anna Rowe, a maritime historian, was researching the psychological toll of submarine warfare when she stumbled upon a mislabeled folder. Inside, Lehman's final letter, Graham's diver report, and photos of the recovered wreck. She read the note with trembling hands. To her, it wasn't just the confession of a German officer. It was a human document, stripped of ideology, a man's conscience surviving where his body had not. Dr. Rowe later visited Hamburg to trace any surviving relatives. She found a daughter, Clara Lehman, now in her 60s. When Rowe read the letter aloud, Clara wept silently. "My father used to send us shells from the sea," she said. "He told me the ocean could wash away everything but the truth." In 1990, a British-German joint expedition returned to the wreck of U-553 to film and document it properly. Clara Lehman joined the crew. Standing on the deck of the research vessel, she gazed at the rolling gray sea that had swallowed her father. As a diver descended with a small brass plaque, she whispered, he was not a hero. He was a man who remembered mercy. They fixed the plaque near the conning tower. It read, "In memory of Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock and the crew of U-553. May the sea judge gently those who sought to be human in inhuman times." The cameras rolled. The waves rolled harder, and somewhere far below, the rusted hull of U-553 lay silent. Its captain's letter now part of the ocean's endless archive. While U-553 was a real German U-boat lost in May 1943 with all hands, the fictionalized figure of Lehmann Willenbrock here symbolizes the real commanders who questioned the ethics of total war. In reality, Lehmann Willenbrock commanded U-96, whose patrols inspired the film Das Boot. The story blends truth and allegory. A man's conscience at war with his orders. The Atlantic is a graveyard of steel, but it is also a museum of memory. Every wreck, every twisted hull beneath the waves holds not just death, but a fragment of truth. For decades after the war, the story of U-553 slept in silence, until one letter changed everything. 93, BBC Radio 4. A quiet Sunday afternoon broadcast titled Echoes Beneath the Sea. The host, journalist Robert Mallory, introduced a recently declassified set of U-boat letters found in the British archives. Among them, he read aloud the final testament of Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock, written aboard U-553. His voice trembled slightly as he read the words, "A man must choose his own law. I could not kill the helpless." For 30 seconds after he finished, the studio was silent. Then the switchboard lit up. Veterans calling, historians debating, families listening in tears. One caller was Anna Rowe, the historian who had uncovered the file. "This letter," she said, "reminds us that conscience is the last battleground, even in war." Another caller, a former Royal Navy sailor, spoke quietly. "I lost my brother to a U-boat. I hated them all my life. But after hearing that letter, maybe I shouldn't have." The letter sparked a storm among historians. At Oxford, Professor David Kershaw argued it was a forgery, a post-war invention to soften the image of the Kriegsmarine. But in Hamburg, the Deutsches U-Boot Museum defended its authenticity. Their archivist, Elizabeth Dreyer, located matching handwriting samples from Lehmann Willenbrock's earlier correspondence. "Same pressure, same angular script," she said. "It's his hand," without question. By 1995, the letter was featured in a German documentary, Das Gewissen des Meeres, The Conscience of the Sea. The film contrasted propaganda speeches of Admiral Dönitz with the final words of Lehmann. The juxtaposition was haunting, the rhetoric of glory against the whisper of guilt. Clara Lehmann became an unexpected figure of public attention. Invited to London for a panel discussion, she stood before a crowd of journalists, veterans, and students. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "My father was a loyal officer. But loyalty to evil is not virtue. He saw that too late. His letter is not redemption. It's remorse." She paused. "And that is why I forgive him." The audience was silent. Cameras flashed. Behind her, on a large projection screen, the photograph of U-553's rusted hull filled the room. A coffin of iron and memory. 96. Lieutenant Peter Graham, now retired, returned to the North Atlantic site. The brass plaque that had been placed near the conning tower 6 years earlier was still there, encrusted with algae, but unbroken. He floated above it, the slow rhythm of his breathing the only sound in the world. He reached out, brushing his gloved hand along the edge of the inscription. It was almost illegible now, but he knew the words by heart. "May the sea judge gently those who sought to be human in inhuman times." Graham later wrote in his dive log, "The ocean has no hatred. It swallows both hunter and hunted." Maybe that's the only justice that ever made sense. In 2003, U-553. The captain's letter became a case study at the University of Cambridge's War Ethics course. Professor Helen Shaw began her lecture with a simple question: when does obedience become a sin? She told her students about the U-boat's final patrol, the discovery of the wreck, the letter, and the debate that followed. Her conclusion echoed across the silent hall. History does not remember the men who killed efficiently. It remembers the few who hesitated, who asked even once, "Why?" One student wrote in his journal after class, "Maybe morality isn't the absence of darkness. Maybe it's refusing to drown in it." 2020. The wreck of U-553 was revisited by a German research team using remote-operated submersibles. The images broadcast on monitors showed the once feared submarine now covered in coral, home to small schools of fish drifting through shattered compartments. As the ROV's camera passed the captain's quarters, the operator zoomed in. A rusted emblem still faintly visible on the wall. The eagle of the Kriegsmarine, its wings half-eaten by time. Next to it, the brass plaque placed by Clara and Graham glimmered under the ROV's light beam, algae dancing like green fireflies in the current. The lead researcher, Dr. Lucas Meyer, whispered into his headset, "It's strange, isn't it? This machine was built for death, yet now it shelters life. The sea keeps no records, yet somehow it preserves what matters." The letter of one U-boat captain, forgotten in an archive for half a century, outlived the empire he fought for, not because it glorified him, but because it revealed the one truth war tries to bury, that even in the heart of destruction, a man can still choose to be human. And so, the story of Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock, real or not, saint or sinner, became something more than legend. It became a mirror for every soldier, every commander, every man who ever followed orders and wondered afterward whether he should have. The wreck of U-553 still rests in the cold Atlantic, 200 meters below the surface. But its final message rises with every tide. The conscience of one man can outlast an empire. The North Atlantic, calm under a gray dawn. A research vessel, RV Helios, drifts above coordinates once marked in red ink on Allied maps. U-553, presumed lost. It is the year 2024. On board are historians, divers, filmmakers, and descendants. Among them, Lucas Meyer, marine archaeologist, Clara Lehmann, daughter of the captain, and a quiet British historian named James Whitmore, grandson of a merchant sailor sunk by a U-boat in 1942. They have come not to glorify, nor to condemn, but to remember. A submersible descends into the blue-black. Its floodlights pierce the darkness, revealing the ghost of U-553, a shape half buried in sand, ribs of rust and coral swaying gently with the current. Inside the viewing dome, Clara presses her palm against the glass. Her reflection merges with the image of the wreck. 79 years, she whispers. And still it feels alive. Lucas nods. The ocean never forgets. It just waits. As the sub circles the wreck, the camera captures the faded markings. The iron cross on the conning tower, the shattered periscope, the silent torpedo tubes that once sent death across the waves. And then, just above the silted deck, the brass plaque gleams faintly, the one placed decades ago by divers Graham and Clara herself. The words, still legible under the marine growth, "May the sea judge gently those who sought to be human in inhuman times." On shore, in a lab lit by digital screens, the team pores over recovered data. Sonar scans, pressure readings, underwater footage. Amid the technical reports lies a single sheet of paper, a scanned copy of Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock's final letter. The script is uneven, written by hand trembling from exhaustion. "I have obeyed my orders. But tonight, I cannot obey my soul. The men will not understand, nor will my superiors. Yet I cannot destroy the innocent and live with what remains of myself." For a long time, no one speaks. Then Whitmore, the British historian, leans forward and says quietly, "My grandfather was killed by a U-boat in '42. I grew up hating that name, Lehmann. But reading this, I realize hate is easy. Understanding is the hard part." Clara turns to him. Her eyes glisten, but her voice is steady. "My father wasn't a hero. He was just tired of being a weapon." Months later, Berlin, Deutsches Historisches Museum. A new exhibit opens. The Conscience Beneath. The story of U-553. Visitors wander through dimly lit corridors where relics are displayed under glass. The captain's logbook. A recovered cap emblem. Sonar images of the wreck. A recording plays softly through hidden speakers. The sound of ocean waves, blended with fragments from the captain's letter, narrated in German and English. On one wall in white letters, the exhibit's dedication reads, "In memory of those who fought, those who suffered, and those who questioned." At the opening ceremony, Clara speaks briefly. "We tell these stories not to rewrite the past, but to remind the present. Conscience is not weakness. It is what makes us human." Later that same year, a clip from the documentary airs in classrooms across Europe. Students watch the footage of the submersible, the letter, the rusted wreck. Their teacher, Ms. Hoffman, asks, "What do you think this captain felt?" A boy answers, "Guilt." A girl adds, "Maybe freedom." Another pauses, then says, "He didn't surrender to the enemy. He surrendered to himself." The teacher smiles softly. "Exactly." Back at sea, the sun sets over the Atlantic. The waves roll endlessly, indifferent, eternal. Somewhere below, U-553 sleeps, wrapped in silence. But above, its story continues to ripple, through history books, documentaries, and quiet reflections of those who choose conscience over command. The camera pans across the horizon as Clara, standing on the deck, drops a single white rose into the water. It drifts away, spinning gently on the surface until it vanishes into the dusk. "Rest well, Vater," she murmurs. "You finally surfaced." In the archives of Berlin, the captain's final letter now rests beside thousands of other wartime documents, each a fragment of the moral labyrinth that was the Second World War. But this one stands apart. It is not a record of victory or defeat. It is the confession of a man who realized that his war was not against the Allies, but against his own soul. And perhaps that is why it endures. Because long after the gunfire faded and the banners fell, one truth remained. Even in the darkest depths, conscience still breathes.